A Lovecraftian horror from beyond the galaxy's rim, the silent screen of the Tyranid swarm sends even the most hardened space marines plunging into madness and sentences entire worlds to consumption to sate its bottomless hunger. In this video, we're going to explore how this enigmatic alien force plays on the tabletop of Warhammer 40k, its rules and mechanical themes, strengths and weaknesses, popular units and sub-factions, and the most common list archetypes it brings to the table. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to the first in what I hope is a new video series where I break down a tactical overview of the factions in Warhammer 40k and cover how they play on the table, common strategies, and pros and cons of the faction. Keep in mind that I'm going to be approaching this rundown from a competitive ITC standpoint, so while most of the information is going to be useful to any 40k player, I may make some points based specifically on the ITC scoring system. On their surface, Tyranids play a lot like any other mid-range faction in 40k. They bring a decent presence in all phases of the game, with a slight emphasis on psychic and melee. The faction's unique ability, Synapse, makes their troops almost entirely immune to morale while nearby their commanders, while imposing a small penalty if they're ever separated from their Synapse creatures. This also creates a unique dynamic for Tyranid generals, who will need to balance inclusion and the position on the table of their Synapse creatures both before and during the game, so as not to lose Synapse support too early on. If you're fighting Tyranids and ever able to remove Synapse creatures from their army, it can quickly fall apart due to low leadership scores and penalties to hit imposed on their ranged units. Keep in mind that Synapse auras are Hive fleet specific, so in mixed Hive fleet lists, it might be even easier to remove support for some units than it appears. Tyranids also sport a sub-theme of -1 to hit auras on their own troops via their Spore Clouds mechanic that blankets their units in specific areas with a -1 to hit penalty, and can be stacked with relics or psychic powers to a -2 or even -3 penalty in some cases. This can combo into some fairly durable units, especially on their monstrous characters such as Hive Tyrants, or buff the survivability of large hordes of basic troops. Keep in mind that, like Synapse, the Spore Cloud auras of units like Venomthropes or Malanthropes is kinda racist and Hive fleet specific, so in mixed lists the whole army will rarely benefit from it. Now let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the faction holistically. Overall, Tyranids bring a fairly well-rounded game plan, including decent but short-range shooting and above-average melee units. Many of the Tyranids' unique profiles also make them excellent at clearing out hordes of enemies. Popular units like Genestealers can output up to 160 attacks in a single round of combat, all with solid accuracy and AP values, and high-volume weapons like Brainleech Devourers can quickly thin out enemy units at close range. They also have a top-level Psychic phase that's close to being top 3 in the game. While not as strong as factions like Eldar or especially Grey Knights that absolutely dominate the Psychic phase, Tyranids are able to leverage a high incidence of Psychers, especially aggressive Smiters, along control effects like Shadow in the Warp and Deepest Shadow from Hive Fleet Kronos to punish armies that rely on key powers going off to work their combos. Additionally, the game's designers have represented the unending Tyranid swarm by focusing much of the faction's power in its HQ and troop slots, which boast some of the most powerful line units in the game, and while many lists will dip into elites or heavy support for 1 or 2 key pieces, you'll find that building battalions in Tyranids comes more naturally than almost any other faction outside Imperial Guard. But all these benefits pale in comparison to the faction's #1 asset, and that is an absolute and almost unparalleled domination of the movement phase. With a high base speed on most of their units and multiple ways to move them several times a turn, like Metabolic Overdrive, Overrun, Hive Commander, and Opportunistic Advance, as well as multiple ways to buff or reroll charges, it's often hard for an opponent to be truly safe from the charge of a Tyranid melee unit. With an appropriate allocation of stratagems and abilities, it's possible to send a fast model like a Winged Hive Tyrant almost 90 inches across the table, something that basically no other faction in the entire game can do. This gives Tyranids a competitive edge in progressive objective play, where they can be on almost any objective on the table with objective-secured bodies, given the right setup and game state, and typically rely heavily on bonus points to secure an early battle point lead in the game. Unfortunately, being able to achieve these Usain Bolt levels of velocity, Tyranid organisms usually have to shed the heavy armor and strong saves favored by other factions. This makes the biggest drawback of the Tyranids its survivability. Most of the faction is missing saves better than a 4+, with the elusive 2 2+ armor save basically entirely unrepresented. While stacking hit modifiers and benefiting from adaptive physiologies can help shore up the Tyranid squishiness, Tyranid players will also find their frontline units depleted by round 3 and relying on the Tyranid's early game battle point lead to close it out. Earlier I also mentioned the short range of Tyranid shooting, which, while it can be powerful when leveraging abilities like Symbiostorm or Single-Minded Annihilation, it is capped almost universally at 36 inches. This forces Tyranid gun lines to play relatively aggressively and means that the faction often falls apart when dealing with counter battery that outranges it. To make matters worse, the scrabbling claws and living ammunition of a Tyranid army often have a hard time punching through the armor of enemy heavies, even when they can get to grips with them. There are very few long-range anti-armor options in the Tyranid army. You have to be willing to shell out the 200 points for a Tyrannifex to even consider bringing a weapon equivalent to a las cannon, and anything T8 or higher can pose a serious issue for Tyranids. While a swarm can usually muster enough damage to kill one knight equivalent threat, downing more than one is difficult and costly, and penetrating deep enough into enemy lines to engage your long guns hiding in their deployment zone can often be impossible. Now before we continue, I'm going to go over some of the characteristic models and sub-factions for Tyranids that create their most common combos. The absolute and most important model in the faction is the big stabby boy himself, Mr. Swarmlord. While his damage output is roughly equivalent to a buffed Space Marine captain, and his defensive stats are almost identical to a standard Hive Tyrant, this character Hive Tyrant is an auto-include in basically 90% of Tyranid archetypes, and is responsible in part for the Tyranid's exceptional mobility due to his unique ability Hive Commander, which allows a single unit to move and advance during the shooting phase instead of shooting. Hive Commander has so many uses it's actually mind-boggling. From rocketing fast melee threats like Gene Stealers or Hive Tyrants across the board to achieve frankly obscene threat ranges, to taking table space or objectives with less powerful units like Gants, or even using it to move Psychers back to the safety of your lines after they launch a barrage of psychic powers. The flexibility of Hive Commander makes it one of the most powerful datasheet abilities in the entire game. In fact, a lot of Tyranid matchups can be decided by how quickly your opponent can remove the Swarmlord, but given his relatively fast movement, small physical model, and resilient defensive stat line, this makes it difficult in a lot of cases. Even in the late game, Swarlord can begin Hive Commanding himself to rocket up the board and close out games with his powerful melee presence and psychic powers. Part 2 of the classic Tyranid combo are Gene Stealers, a simple troops choice and one of the most effective melee infantry in the game. With a high speed and starting at 4 base melee attacks, and a swath of free melee upgrades that allow them to adapt their kit for the enemy that they're fighting, Gene Stealers have a rightfully earned reputation as a terror in close combat. With Acid Maws and Rending Claws to output high AP damage against armored targets, and the ability to freely swap to Scything Talons for accuracy against invulnerable saves, makes them effective against a wide variety of targets without actually costing any extra points. Last but not least, the two mainstays of the Tyranid ranged game at the moment are Hive Guard and Exocrines. While Exocrines are fairly straightforward ranged tanks with up to 12 AP3 autocannon shots, Hive Guard are a little trickier. When they're armed with their Impaler cannons, Hive Guard become the most powerful indirect fire almost in the entire game, with each model armed with the equivalent of a 2-shot battle cannon that ignores both line of sight and cover and has the ability to fire twice thanks to the Single-Minded Annihilation stratagem. The biggest downside is their relatively short range of 36 inches, which on the surface doesn't sound all that short. However, the unit's low survivability typically forces them into a defensive position out of line of sight that their targets can more easily avoid. These powerful units are in their element when brought with specific sub-faction benefits, and Tyranids have a wide variety of high fleet sub-factions to choose from when building detachments. But, as with many sub-faction options in the game, they are not all created equal. As a side note, unlike other factions, Tyranids cannot field mixed detachments, so you'll have to bring a pure detachment of a particular high fleet in order to gain access to that sub-faction's abilities, stratagems, and psychic powers. The elephant-like organism in the incubation chamber is High Fleet Kraken, which rolls the most individual benefits into a single sub-faction. High Fleet Kraken units have the benefits of rolling extra dice and choosing the highest on their advanced rolls, all but ensuring advances of 5 or 6 inches, the ability to double the number of that advance with the opportunistic advance stratagem, and can fall back and still charge out of any resulting combats. Combine that with basically getting the Behemoth High Fleet adaptation as a psychic power, there's little reason not to play High Fleet Kraken when you're trying to get to melee. This High Fleet also powers one of the most feared and powerful combos the faction has access to. By advancing Gene Stealers or other fast melee units with Onslaught cast on them, Then, using the opportunistic advance stratagem to double the distance of that advance, then Hive commanding them using a Swarm Lord, and potentially even double moving him into a forward position with Metabolic Overdrive, then charging with a reroll afterwards from Synaptic Lure, you can easily and very reliably achieve a melee threat range of upwards of 40 inches. The second most seen Hive fleet is Cronus, which powers up ranged attacks by giving its gun-toting bugs reroll 1s to hit, and potentially exploding 6s to hit with its Psychic Power Symbiostorm. Keep in mind that Symbiostorm combos favorably with hit modifiers, so units like Exocrines or Tyranid warriors that often get +1 or +2 to hit will explode even more easily, often resulting in a 100 or 120% conversion rate for its hits, but negative hit modifiers will also affect it as well. By making the already decently powerful Tyranid shooting even more consistent, it's not surprising that Cronus makes its way into a lot of competitive lists, and Deepest Shadow, its unique stratagem, being one of the most consistent and powerful psychic denial effects in the game, is icing on the delicious insectoid cake. Honorable mentions for Hive fleets are Behemoth and Jormungandr. Behemoth's only benefit of rerolling charges is a little underwhelming, but its unique psychic power is extremely powerful, giving a Behemoth unit +1 to wound in melee. This alone might be enough to bring Behemoth to a higher level of play, but its short range and inconsistency makes it a little awkward to pull off. Jormungandr is a popular choice for lists focused on the big stompy bugs, since in most cases it's just a global +1 armor save for your entire army. However, the Hive fleet has a bit of an identity crisis. It buffs the big heavy monsters much more than the small ones, but doesn't affect units that fly, some of the most powerful monsters in the faction. And while it wants to bring in reserves to benefit from some of its abilities, does little to benefit Tyrannocytes, one of the best ways to bring Tyranid reserves to the table. Melee-focused reserves also rarely benefit from their adaptation as a result of charging, since the Jormungandr benefit falls off if you advance or declare a charge. That said, with one of the strongest warlord traits in the Codex, and the recent addition of adaptive physiologies that combo well with the Jormungandr benefit, plus some funky jank stemming from its unique psychic power, I do believe that Jormungandr has some undiscovered gems lurking in its tunnel networks. With the most popular units and sub-factions covered, now we're going to talk about the playstyle of the list as a whole. While several archetypes may approach the game a little differently, most Tyranid lists rely on a similar strategy. That is, rushing the board early to engage or neutralize the most dangerous enemy pieces as quickly as possible, and run up the score on bonus points and maneuver secondaries, while hoping to deal enough follow-up damage with their slower heavy hitters or ranged weapons to cripple any enemy counterattack. Similar to other aggressive armies in the game, for this reason you'll typically see Tyranid players with a dominating lead in the early game, which quickly peters out as their first wave is cleared off by the enemy. What often determines victory in such games is how well the Tyranid player can leverage their linebacker units to actually close out the battle, and whether their early lead was enough to push them through till the end. This playstyle can be subverted depending on the list archetype that you're facing against, so let's cover some of the most popular types of lists brought by Tyranid armies. The first two archetypes you'll hear people talk about most often when they're referring to Tyranids are actually pretty similar. One is a Genestealer aggro combo that relies on the Opportunistic Advance plus Hive Commander plus Synaptic Lore combo I covered earlier to deliver Genestealers into your opponent's line as rapidly as possible. These lists often use Genestealers as the first wave to help their other heavy hitters like Broodlords and Hive Tyrants make it to melee. Another popular archetype is a Gaunt Carpet, a pure horde list that puts 300 plus models on the table and relies on overlapping defensive buffs to keep them alive, while forcing enemies to stay in their deployment zone, and relying entirely on characters to deal damage and remove models. Unfortunately, that melee aggro is a little hard to deliver in the meta right now, and many lists are more than capable of killing 300 low toughness models, even with the buffs afforded by Malanthropes or custom Hive Fleet abilities. So many Tyranid lists have moved towards the third archetype that's more commonly seen. That is, a bug gun line that relies on Exocrines, Hive Guard, and Warriors, with occasionally some mixed-in Genestealer cult units like Ridge Runners or characters to put out immense damage at medium range. These lists are fairly one-dimensional, and need to include some heavy melee units to prevent them from being tied up in melee indefinitely, but if they run into matchups where their particular weapon profiles are favored, they can be very powerful. In my opinion, however, the most powerful archetype is a mid-range list that makes use of Chronos shooting alongside the threat range and board control of Kraken units. We've already seen similar lists do fairly well in competitive play, and I expect to see them more as the 2020 season continues. So that's a pretty high-level overview of the Tyranid faction as it stands currently in 40k. I believe Tyranids are in a good place in the meta right now, even able to compete toe-to-toe with powerhouses like Space Marines or Eldari. I'd like to delve deeper into Tyranid play with a greater analysis of units and abilities, so if that's something you'd like to see, let me know down in the comments. Also, if you like this type of high-level faction overview, drop me a comment about that as well, and let me know what faction you'd like me to cover next. Remember to check out Tactical Tortoise on Patreon for early access to videos and T5S2 tournament pods. And keep it classy, folks. Happy wargaming.